In a folder marked Cocke County 1955, Box 1-2, inside the Archives of Appalachia at East Tennessee State University. There is a handwritten ledger kept by a country doctor named J.R. Mitchell. On page 47, he made a note that historians still argue about. He wrote that in 31 years of practice in the hollows above Cosby, Tennessee, he had treated farmers, school teachers, and railroad men for pneumonia, influenza, and the wasting fevers of the mountains, but he had almost never treated a moonshiner. This is the paradox. The men and women who worked nights in damp creek beds, breathing wood smoke and copper vapor, sleeping rough, eating poorly, exposed to every cold rain that swept down from the Smokies, they should have been the sickest people in the county. They were, by every measurement available, the healthiest. They lived longer than the preachers. They outlasted the merchants. And when the influenza of 1,918 swept through the southern Appalachians and killed nearly 700,000 Americans, the still houses tucked into the laurel thickets of Cocke and Madison counties buried fewer of their own than any other group in the region. Joseph Earl Dabney recorded this in his 1974 book Mountain Spirits, drawing from interviews conducted across 4 states. The Foxfire collections, beginning with the first volume published in 1972, documented the same pattern from a different angle. The question is not whether it happened, the question is how. To understand the answer, you have to understand the world these people lived in before the federal government ever climbed their ridges. In the years between 1,890 and 1,920, the southern Appalachians were among the most isolated regions in the United States. A doctor in Madison County, North Carolina, might serve a territory of 40 square miles on horseback. Hospitals were a day's wagon ride away, sometimes 2. When a child caught the croup at midnight in a cabin above Spring Creek, no one was coming. The family treated it themselves, with what grew on the slopes behind the smokehouse, with what hung drying in the rafters, and with what sat in jars on the top shelf of the kitchen. What sat in those jars was almost always one of 2 things. Honey gathered from hollow gum trees by men who knew which ridges held the white sourwood blooms, and clear corn liquor distilled by the same families, sometimes the same hands, in copper pots that had been passed down for 3 generations. The liquor was not for drinking, at least not the way outsiders imagined it. Horace Kephart, who moved into the Great Smoky Mountains in 1904 and published Our Southern Highlanders in 1913, wrote that the mountain people regarded a jug of pure corn whiskey the way a city pharmacist regarded his cabinet. It was a solvent. It was a preservative. It pulled the medicine out of roots and barks that water alone could not touch. A pint of high-proof spirit, properly steeped with the right plant for the right number of days, became something the family depended on through every winter. The plants were specific, and the knowledge was old. Ginseng root, called sang in the hollows, dug only in the fall after the berries reddened, steeped for cough and exhaustion. Yellow root, scraped from the banks of cold streams, used for sore throat and stomach complaint. Black cohosh for the women. Sassafras bark for spring tonic taken in March to thin what the old people called winter blood. Pennyroyal, mullein, boneset, life everlasting. Each one had a season, each one had a method, and each one was preserved in alcohol. Alcohol was the only thing in the cabin that would keep a tincture stable from one harvest to the next. But the knowledge of how to do this, which root, which proof, which steeping time, did not come from books. It came from grandmothers. It came from grandfathers. It came from the long evenings on the porch when an old man corrected a young one without ever raising his voice. And by the early 20th century, that knowledge was already beginning to disappear from the lowlands. In the mountains, it survived because the mountains were poor, and poverty preserves what wealth replaces. Then came the turning point. In January of 1920, the Volstead Act took effect, and a way of life that had existed for nearly 200 years was declared a federal crime overnight. The men who came up the ridges to enforce that law did not understand what they were walking into. They believed they were chasing criminals. They were chasing pharmacists. They were chasing the only medical system many of these communities had ever known. The federal response escalated through the 1920s. Revenue agents working out of district offices in Asheville, Knoxville, and Roanoke began destroying stills at a rate the mountains had never seen. Internal Revenue Service enforcement reports from 1,925 document more than 9,000 stills cut down in a single year across western North Carolina, East Tennessee, and Southwest Virginia. Court records from the Western District of Virginia show prison sentences of 1 to 3 years for men whose only crime, by their own understanding, was making the same medicine their fathers had made. The Moonshiners responded with ingenuity that historians are still cataloging. They moved their operations deeper into the laurel hells, the dense thickets that federal men in city shoes could not penetrate without guides. They built submarine stills, half buried in creek banks, vented through hollow logs. They learned to run their fires only on overcast days when the smoke would not rise straight. They posted children as lookouts on the ridges, trained to whistle the call of a particular bird that did not actually live in those woods. And the women became the backbone of the entire system. Maggie Bailey of Harlan County, Kentucky, born in 1904, ran liquor for more than 60 years and was never convicted of a felony. She was called the Queen of the Mountain Bootleggers. She gave money to widows. She paid for funerals. When she finally died in 2005, at the age of 101, the line at her wake stretched out the door of the funeral home and down the street. In Franklin County, Virginia, Willie Carter Sharp drove cars loaded with white liquor down mountain roads at speeds that federal agents could not match. She testified in the Great Moonshine Conspiracy Trial of 1935, the largest Prohibition-era prosecution in American history. With court transcripts now held in the National Archives at Atlanta, she told the court she had run liquor through 110 roadblocks. She told them she had done it because her family needed to eat. The lesson from what these men and women did, it applies to anybody today who feels crushed by a system designed to keep them dependent. Consider what the Mountain families actually possessed. They possessed knowledge that could not be taken from them. They possessed skills that did not require permission. They possessed a network of neighbors who would lie to a federal agent before they would betray a cousin. And they possessed the understanding that their health, their medicine, and their livelihood were not things to be purchased from a distant institution. They were things to be made, grown, gathered, and preserved at home. You do not need a copper still to apply this. You need a shelf. A shelf with the things on it that your great-grandmother would have recognized. Dried elderberry for winter, honey from a beekeeper whose name you know, garlic, ginger, a bottle of something simple that you made yourself from a recipe you can trace to a real person. The principle is not nostalgia. The principle is sovereignty. The Mountain families understood that whoever controls your medicine controls your fear, and whoever controls your fear controls your vote, your wallet, and your silence. They refused that arrangement. You can refuse it too on a smaller scale, in a city apartment with a windowsill and a willingness to learn, but the federal pressure kept rising. By the early 1930s, raids in Cobb County, Tennessee had become weekly events. Families lost fathers to federal prison. Children grew up visiting them in Atlanta and Lewisburg. The old knowledge began to thin. Some of the men who knew the most about which root went into which jar died in cells far from the mountains they had walked their entire lives. The community seemed about to lose something it could never replace. And then came a man named Marvin Sutton, born in Maggie Valley, North Carolina in 1946, known to everyone as Popcorn. He was not the greatest moonshiner in history. He was something more important. He was the last one who wrote it down. In 1999, Popcorn Sutton self-published a memoir titled Me and My Liquor. He printed it himself. He sold it out of the trunk of his car. In that book, and in the hours of video he recorded before his death in 2009, he preserved these specific techniques. The specific plants, the specific timings that the old men of Cobb County had carried in their heads for 200 years. He named the herbs, he named the proportions, he named the families who had taught him. The Archives of Appalachia at East Tennessee State University now holds a collection of Sutton's recordings donated after his death. In one of those tapes, transcribed by university researchers, Popcorn explains why the Moonshiners almost never got sick. He says it plainly. He says they drank a small measure of bitters every morning, yellowroot, ginseng, and life everlasting, steeped in clear corn. They had done it since they were boys, because their daddies had done it, because their granddaddies had done it. He says the federal men never understood that the still was not a factory. The still was a kitchen, and the kitchen was a pharmacy. That is the answer to the paradox. The Moonshiners stayed healthy because the same skill that made them outlaws also made them physicians of their own bodies. The knowledge was almost lost. One man, working alone with a cheap printer and a video camera, preserved enough of it for the universities to catch up. The archive recorded it, now you know it. Real American history has been softened, sanitized, and buried, and if you have made it this far, you understand why this channel exists. Here is the question. Of the figures named in this video, Maggie Bailey of Harlan County, Willie Carter Sharp of Franklin County, or Popcorn Sutton of Maggie Valley, which one would you have wanted as a neighbor, and why? Leave your answer in the comments, and tell us what state or country you are watching from. The replies on this channel are read by a growing community of people who refuse to let this history disappear. Subscribe, and stay close. The next video tells the story of Amos Owens, the cherry bounce man of Rutherford County, North Carolina, who served 3 federal sentences, walked out of prison the 3rd time at the age of 76, still refusing to give up the recipe his mother had taught him in 1839.